All right, I think we're good. Mayor, Chief, you good? Ready? Okay. Anybody not ready? All right. So, I'm going to now talk about the shooting that occurred in St. Petersburg yesterday afternoon involving 20-year-old Dominique Harris. By way of background, I think you know, and for those that don't, let me just recap that the investigation is being conducted by the Pinellas County Use of Deadly Force Task Force. Remember that this task force was created to ensure that we have in these investigations complete, thorough, and objective investigations by an entity other than the one that employs the officer or deputy who engaged in the deadly force. It is important that the investigation be thorough, that it be objective, but it is so vitally important that the community have confidence in the results of the investigation without the community having any concern about a conflict of interest due to agencies conducting investigations of their own officers or deputies. At its core, that's why we created the Pinellas County Use of Deadly Force Task Force. This investigation, because it occurred in the city of St. Petersburg and the use of deadly force was by St. Petersburg officers, the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office is the lead agency in the investigation, and the other participating agencies include homicide detectives from the Clearwater Police Department and the Pinellas Park Police Department. Now, I want to remind you that we're conducting a criminal investigation, a criminal homicide investigation, and what we're charged with doing is making a determination whether the officer's use of deadly force was lawful under Florida law. These facts that we uncover will be provided to Chief Holloway in the St. Petersburg Police Department so that he can determine whether his officers' actions were consistent with St. Petersburg Police Department policies and best practices. That's not our job. Our job is to determine whether the officers acted in conformity with Florida law conducting a criminal homicide investigation. But again, all the facts and evidence that we gather will be used by the St. Pete Police Department to determine if policy and best practices were followed. While the task force conducts its criminal investigation, there's also a parallel and independent investigation conducted by the state attorney's office. The state attorney interviews the witnesses and reviews the evidence independently, and the state attorney will render his own determination. As I said last night, is that everything at this stage is preliminary. We are providing you with the information the best we can with what we know at the moment. One of the things that we always struggle with, that I struggle with in these incidents, these situations, these investigations, is trying to be as absolutely transparent as we can, trying to provide as much information we can, balanced against that we don't have all the information. And I really want you all to keep in mind, and the public to keep in mind, that we're trying to do the right thing here, the best thing, and what's in the interest of the community, and that is provide information. But as new facts are developed, as new information is developed, as new evidence is gleaned, and more interviews are conducted, some of it could change. And so it's important that we get the information out. And you know, in the past, some have taken the approach, they're not going to provide anything until they have everything. And I don't think it's a good way to go. So we're trying to get this out. But again, we have more information today than we did last night. And we'll have more information in tomorrow and the days following than we do today. But we're going to provide the information the best we can as we know it now. So this incident happened yesterday at about 4:15 p.m. in the parking lot of the Food Max store at 1400 18th Avenue South in St. Petersburg. Now, I'm going to provide you with some background about how the officers ended up in the parking lot of the Food Max store. On September 17th of 2020, a few months ago, Marquise Rory Scott was shot and killed in St. Petersburg. The St. Petersburg Police Department has been conducting a homicide investigation since Scott's murder. The St. Pete Police Department Major Crimes Unit identified Dominique Harris as a possible suspect in Scott's murder, and detectives wanted to question him about the homicide. Detectives also learned through credible information that Harris was known to carry guns on his person and also in a backpack that he carried. On October 27th of 2020, so a little more than a month after that homicide, there was a 15-year-old boy who was playing at a basketball playground at 2216 27th Street South in St. Pete, when this 15-year-old boy had a verbal altercation with some other kids as they're playing basketball. Dominique Harris was not involved in the basketball game, but for some reason, he injected himself into this verbal altercation. And he picked up the 15-year-old boy and slammed him to the ground. He also began to punch him several times in the torso area, and he caused injuries to this 15-year-old boy to the extent that it required this 15-year-old boy to go to All Children's Hospital for treatment. St. Petersburg Police Department conducted an investigation, and detectives established probable cause for Dominique Harris' arrest on felony child abuse charges for beating the kid on the playground. Because Harris was wanted for questioning in the Scott murder and the probable cause that St. Pete police had for Harris' arrest for slamming the kid and injuring the 15-year-old boy, the police department's SIU, or Special Investigations Unit, was asked yesterday to find Harris and to arrest him. Again, because he needed to go to jail for hurting that 15-year-old kid that caused him to go to All Children's Hospital, and because he was a suspect in a homicide and they wanted to interview him, and they knew that Harris was known to carry firearms, and he was also known to flee from law enforcement. Now, regarding Harris, is that he has an extensive criminal history as an adult and a juvenile, with arrests for robbery, carjacking, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, burglary, throwing a deadly missile into an occupied dwelling, battery, grand theft auto, hit and run and reckless driving, criminal mischief, resisting arrest, fleeing and eluding high speed with wanton disregard for safety. As a juvenile, Harris was sentenced to Department of Juvenile Justice residential programs, and for about 2 years, he had been monitored by Pinellas County's HOME program. And if you're not familiar with HOME, it's an initiative that the St. Pete Police Department, the Sheriff's Office, Largo, Clearwater, and others established a few years ago to address prolific juvenile offenders, those who are the worst of the worst that are out there wreaking havoc in the community, committing crime. And Harris was monitored for about 2 years by the HOME program. He was a prolific juvenile offender. So against that backdrop, the SIU detectives who were tasked with finding him yesterday received a packet of information from detectives about Harris, his physical description, a car he may be driving, areas he may frequent. They found Harris yesterday afternoon coming out of a residence in St. Petersburg, and he was driving the car that they had been provided information about. Harris was accompanied when he left this house by a friend of his. Now, initially, it had been reported to us that this person, whose name is Khalik Blackman, was Harris's brother. He's not his brother, he's just a very close friend. So Harris and Blackman are in the car and they're driving around St. Petersburg. SIU detectives are following them and they're trying to get a positive identification on Harris. He had a sweatshirt on with a hood, and they were relatively sure it was Harris, but not positive. So they waited until he landed at the food mart, parked his car. Harris and Blackman got out of the car and walked inside. Now, there's an independent female witness, totally uninvolved, a woman that was there shopping, that told us when Harris and Blackman got out of the car is that Harris had a concealed firearm that wasn't totally concealed because she could see in his waistband, he had a firearm in his waistband when he went into the store. So Harris and Blackman go into the store, they come back out. When they came back out, they went back in the car. Blackman then goes back in the store. Harris is sitting in the car by himself. And again, according to SIU detectives, is that they were pretty sure that it was Harris, but they needed to confirm it. So they called for uniformed patrol officers. 2 patrol officers, a K-9 officer and an officer assigned to the area, arrived and parked their cars and walked up to Harris' vehicle. This is all captured on video. And as they walk up to the car, Harris rolled the window down. They asked him for his identification. He produced his identification, and they were able to confirm that it in fact was Dominique Harris. They asked him to step out of the car so that they could arrest him and take him into custody, and he immediately rolled the window up of the car. At that point, as he's rolling up the window, he's reaching over into the console area. The officers were concerned that he was reaching for a firearm based upon his actions, and the officers decided at that point to try and break the window to get him out of the car because of the situation that they were in. So as they tried to break the window and Harris wasn't coming out of the car, Harris took the car, put it in reverse, gunned it, squealing the tires, and hits a cruiser that is parked directly behind his car. He then jams it down in drive and drives fast forward into a concrete pillar right in front of the store. So he's parked, goes backwards, hits the cruiser, jams it forward into the concrete pillar, backs up again, and does a three-point turn going from south to north. As he's going from south to north, he hits a citizen's car who was in the parking lot. At that point, he comes to a rest just south of 18th Avenue South in the parking lot of the store facing north. Because of the officers being unable to get him out of the car, because of them trying to break the window, information had been put out over the radio that those officers needed assistance, and the SIU detectives who were doing the surveillance had begun to move into the area. So as Harris was trying to get out of the parking lot, squealing the tires, hit the citizen's car, and was right there at the edge of 18th Avenue South in the parking lot of the convenience store, is that one of the SIU detectives was able to pull his car directly in front of Harris. So the SIU detective and Harris's car were head to head. At that point, other detectives came into the area. One of the other detectives parked his car just to the west of the original car that had blocked Harris. That detective opened the door of his car, and he was probably about 2-3 feet. If both, put it this way, if both car doors were open, they're touching. So it's at a point blank range, it's very short distance, he's right on top of him. And as that detective got out of his car to confront Harris, Harris had this gun, which is a 9mm semi-automatic, and he pointed it out the window of the car, and he fired, striking the officer. At that point, the officer who was in the car that had pinned Harris in, who was directly to the north, is that he saw Harris with a gun in his hand, and he had pulled the gun back in, and it was facing forward at the windshield, so at the officer that was right in front of him. He began to fire. There were other officers from SIU, detectives, that had arrived on the scene. And every single officer that we interviewed saw Harris with the gun in his hand. At one point, it was in his left hand as he was pointing out the window. At some point, he transitioned it to his right hand, and he was pointing it out the window and shooting at the officer who had tried to get out of his police vehicle. And at a couple of points, he had the firearm facing forward, pointed out the windshield of the vehicle. So the officers were to the north, the officers were to the west, there was officers to the east, and one who was right behind him whose vehicle was disabled because he also struck another vehicle as they came into the parking lot. So those officers, because there was an absolute threat, Harris was trying to kill a cop, he was firing, is that 6 officers shot and fired rounds at Harris. So Harris was in the car. Once the officer who was shot had been removed from the scene, he was taken to the west down the street, put in a patrol car, and taken to the hospital. It appeared that Harris, due to having been shot, was not conscious. Officers went in through the passenger side of Harris's car, and the officer who pulled him out, Harris still had this 9mm semi-automatic handgun in his right hand. It was still in his hand. As they pulled him out, the gun fell out of his hand, and it ended up on the floorboard of the car right there where you see it. Now, one of the things I want to point out to you, because it is important, is that that is a shell casing that came from that gun. So Harris, from what we can tell right now, he had 5 rounds left in the magazine. So this is the magazine. It looks like it's an extended magazine. It's an aftermarket magazine. He had 5 rounds left in the magazine. There was 1 round in the chamber, and that we right now have recovered 4 shell casings. So Harris shot at the officer at least 4 times. And I say at least because that magazine, because an extended magazine could carry more than this number of rounds. We're still going through the car. We're still processing it. So there could be more shell casings in it. The officer was shot twice in the mid-torso area. Very thankfully, he's still in the hospital, but he's in stable condition, and by all accounts, he's going to be okay. The 6 officers who fired, they fired 50 rounds. Harris was shot, again, preliminarily, 38 times. And we are so thankful that more officers other than the one were not shot, and that the injuries to the one officer are not life-threatening, could easily have been, and that he's going to be okay. For whatever reason, and I can't explain it, and as I talked to Dominique Harris's mom and dad last night at the hospital, why? I don't know. Why would a 20-year-old kid decide he wants to kill cops? Why would you fire 4 rounds at an officer 2 feet away? It's probably a question that we'll never be able to answer. But he did it. And you're talking about a kid with a very extensive criminal history, a kid who was a prolific juvenile offender, and a kid that made a decision that a cop's life wasn't worth living, and that he was going to, in the name of getting away, try and kill that cop. So one of the things I also wrestle with in these situations, and I feel pretty strongly about it, feel very strongly about it, is about being transparent, about providing the public with as much information as we possibly can. Because the consequence of not doing that and not being transparent is that it leads to questions, leads to suspicion, and it can lead to distrust. So it's important. And one of the things that we always try and do, that I always try and do, is to identify the personnel who are involved in the shootings. Because again, I think it's important. So why do we do that? We do that because as soon as we name names, the next thing that you all do is a public records request for personnel files, for disciplinary history, for previous shootings, et cetera. And I understand that. That's your job, and that's what the interest is. That's what people want to know. But the challenge here in trying to strike a balance with this, because this is a very unique situation, in that 5 of the 6 officers who shot are in undercover positions. They're undercover personnel. Under Florida public records law, the identity of those officers, because they're in undercover positions, is exempt from disclosure. And again, struggling with this, what I've decided to do in this particular case is I'm going to give you the name of the one patrol officer who fired, but we're not going to identify the names of the undercover personnel because they remain in undercover capacity. And it puts them in jeopardy. It puts them potentially in harm's way, potentially puts their families in harm's way, because they're going to continue to do their jobs. The officer who was shot is going to recover, make his decision whether he returns to work. But we need to be aware that our actions don't cause more harm. And that by putting their names out and identifying them as they continue to try and do their good work in the city of St. Pete, that we don't put them in a bad situation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to identify for you them by their age, their length of service, their discipline history for the last 5 years, and their previous histories of any shootings. But again, I'm going to do this by just identifying them as detective number 1, detective number 2, and not with their names. So the first SIU detective who shot is a white male, 36 years old, and he has 14 years of service with the St. Pete Police Department. He has no prior discipline history in the last 5 years. In 2007, he had an accidental discharge with a firearm, and in 2013, he did discharge a firearm and killed a suspect as a result of an exchange of gunfire. The suspect was wanted for a homicide, and that shooting was ruled justified by the state attorney's office and by a command review board. The next officer is a white male, 37 years old, with 12 years of service to the St. Pete Police Department. His 5-year discipline history is 0, no history of discipline in the last 5 years. He was previously involved in one incident involving a firearm, and it involved him discharging his firearm to kill a vicious dog. So it was not at a person, and that was ruled justified. The next employee is a black female, 29 years of age, 2 years of service as a police officer, no prior shootings, and no incidents of discipline. The next employee is a white male, 41 years of age, 13 years of service to the St. Pete Police Department, no prior discipline, and no prior shooting incidents. The next detective is a 49-year-old black male. He's been with the St. Pete Police Department for 28 years. He has no prior discipline in the last 5 years. He has 2 prior incidents where he discharged his firearm. One was in 2003, and the other one was in 2008. Both of them were exchanges of gunfire. The 2008 incident was with a robbery suspect. And both of those were justified shootings as determined by the state attorney's office and by a command review board of the St. Pete Police Department. The last officer who discharged his weapon and shot, who I will identify for you because he's a patrol officer, and that is Officer Richard McKee, M-C-K-E-E. He's a white male, 58 years old, with 28 years of service as a police officer. His 5-year discipline history, he does have one incident that resulted in a 5-day suspension for improper procedures, and it was related to a check-on, check-off duty violation. He had one prior incident involving a firearm, and that was in 2010, and it was an accidental discharge of his firearm. Nobody was hurt, and it was an accidental discharge. So the investigation is still very much ongoing. There are still interviews to be done. Evidence is still being processed. Detectives from the task force are hard at work. I believe we have an accurate and pretty clear picture now as to what happened, but again, it's subject to change. And from what I can see at this point, to sum it up, Harris was a suspect in a homicide. He was known to carry guns on his person in a backpack. He had hurt by slamming to the ground a 15-year-old boy at a playground who had to go to All Children's Hospital for treatment. Detectives needed to question him in the homicide. He needed to be arrested for what he did. He has an extensive criminal history. He's a prolific juvenile offender. He had histories of burglary and robbery and carjacking and all the other things I described to you, who made a bad decision to arm himself, as the information indicated he had. And when he was confronted by uniformed police officers, and they told him to step out of the car so he could be taken into custody, he made a bad decision. And the bad decision was to resist. And the bad decision was to roll his window up, and when the officers tried to get him out of the car, he puts it in reverse, puts it in drive, drives it, rams into the car, rams into the concrete pole, and tries to get away. Then, when officers pin him in, as opposed to, you got me, is that he then takes out his gun that he was carrying, that he had in his waistband when he went into the store, because the woman saw it, and he shoots a St. Petersburg police officer. And then he continues to fire his gun, and he's pointed it at other officers. And the officers did exactly what they should have done and what they are trained to do, and that is to neutralize the threat and to keep shooting until the threat stops so that they don't get hurt and that they can go home to their families and that they can remain safe. And, you know, unfortunately, it's, you know, a situation where you got another 20-year-old kid that has a long history that just made some bad choices. And, you know, I talked to his mom and dad last night. You know, as I said to them, they didn't do anything wrong. Their son did. And you know, you got to feel for them. They're going through a tough time, I'm sure, as a family. So that's what we know right now. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have to the extent that we can. And if they want to, certainly Mayor Kreitzman and Chief Holloway can answer anything. But you know, I just remind you that as to the facts, as to the circumstances, the way we have this set up here in Pinellas County is that we're the ones that are conducting the investigation. So as to facts, as to evidence, it's probably best, although they can answer any questions they want to, it's probably best that you direct those questions as to facts or evidence to me, because the way this is set up, they don't really have that knowledge at this point other than what they've heard me say here.
Chief, the murder investigation going back to September, was he a suspect in that, or was he just wanted for questioning? Was he an actual suspect?
Well, I'd say, you know, both. You know, they had information, they had developed enough where they needed to bring him in and they wanted to talk to him about it. So he was, you know, and sometimes we get caught up in, you know, what we label people as. He was somebody that they suspected as somebody who may have committed the homicide. You know, sometimes we call them suspects, sometimes we call them persons of interest. We can put these labels and these names on them. It's somebody that they think did the homicide based on information and evidence they had. And that they had information that he was armed, that he was out doing some bad things, and they needed to talk to him and they needed to continue their homicide investigation.
What was the bigger priority for nabbing him? The child abuse charge or getting him in a room to talk about the homicide?
Well, you know, there's no question that that child abuse charge, given the nature of it, because he took a 15-year-old, and again, he stuck his nose where it didn't belong. And this is a guy, you know, what I would say, and I don't know, you know, but I'd say it looks like he's got some sort of issues. Why are you sticking your nose? Is it anger management, whatever it is? He had a temper. You know, why do you take a 15-year-old, slam him to the ground, and then damage the kid's ribs and his torso area to the point where you need to go to All Children's Hospital? You know, Catherine, you can say, and I'll say all day long, a guy like that who's willing to do that and harm a 15-year-old, he needs to face consequences. He needs to get off the street. So
I think there's a lot of questions in the community about why a child abuse charge from October constituted that kind of response.
Well, certainly, and you're correct, and I would agree, is that, you know, it couples with the fact that he was a suspect in a homicide. And I would say on top of that, though, they also had information, and you could easily have a situation where any agency, including ours, would assign something equivalent to SIU to get somebody into custody on a child abuse charge like that when they did that, when they're also known to carry guns and they have the history that this guy has. So you got to put it all together and look at the totality of the circumstances. But I think that there's certainly a reason why they asked SIU to get him into custody based on the totality, and part of the totality is he's a suspect in a homicide. And as you said, to get him in a room, try and talk to him, and to conduct the investigation.
Did he know he was a suspect in this homicide?
I don't know. I don't know that. All right, anybody have anything else you want to ask? All right, we appreciate you being Chief Mayor. Do you have anything you want to? No? Okay. All right, we appreciate you all being here. Thank you, and we'll keep you updated as we learn anything more.